All right, so this is the second chapter on plant diversity. We're going to be focusing on plants that form from seeds and their evolution. So the fact that we have seeds has allowed seed plants to basically take over and serve as the dominant producer in most of our land-based ecosystems. Seeded plants were first are first believed to have shown up around 360 million years ago. Why seeds are so valuable? They serve as protection for the embryo and they give it nutrients to allow it to survive and thrive. And domestication of them happened around 8,000 years ago and allowed for permanent settlements of these seeded plants throughout the world. Okay. Um, Characteristics or traits that are common to all seeded plants are having reduced gametophytes, heterospory, ovules, and pollen. Okay. Why would having reduced gametophytes be a good thing? The gametophytes are able to develop within the walls of the spores, and then they are able to be retained within the tissues of that parent sporophyte. So, to kind of give you a better idea of how the bryophytes, the non vascular plants, are going to work from our vascular plants, we see the gametophyte, and they're labeled on that picture, are going to be dominant with the mosses and the other non vascular plants, while the sporophyte will be in the dominant form for our vascular plants that are seedless and seeded. Um, and it shows a little bit more of how we get the female and male gametophytes for the angiosperms as well as for the gymnosperms, and how the gametophyte, excuse me, is not going to be gender based in the seedless vascular plants. Okay, we talked about homospory and heterospory um, in the previous chapter, that the ancestors of our seeded plants were most likely homospores, but obviously we know now that the seeded plants are heterospores, and how we get the female and the male gametophytes from the megasporangia and the microsporangia, respectively. Again, we talked about those back in chapter 29. The ovule is where the megasporanium resides. It contains the megaspore and integuments. The gymnosperm megaspores typically have one of those, while the angiosperms have two of them. The microspores, that where our male gametophytes are going to be found, are able to develop into the pollen grains. We all love pollen in the springtime, but pollen is what allows our plants to get fertilized. And pollination is when we have the pollen transferred to a seed part of the seed plant that contains the female gametophyte, the ovule. The pollen makes it so that we don't need the water so much, and we can use air or animals, aka birds, to help make the pollen travel. And if that grain is able to germinate, it gives you the pollen tube, which will allow the sperm to go into the female gametophyte and allow that seed to be able to grow into a new plant. Okay. The seed develops from the whole ovule. Why seeds are so helpful? Again, you've got the sporophyte embryo and its food supply surrounded with one another. We'll talk a little bit more about the food supply, the endosperm, in a couple slides. They're able to remain dormant until they need to germinate. Again, they have their own food source and they can travel. So there's the integument that we were talking about before. In a gymnosperm seed, we talked about how the gymnosperms only have one of those. Okay. And so we're going to focus first on gymnosperms, naked seeds. These are exposed on the sporophylls to form the cones, while the angiosperm seeds are found in fruits, aka mature ovaries. Um, it's thought that progymnosperms first started to get some traits that would allow them to be able to serve as seed plants back in the late Devonian period. Again, the seed plants are divided into both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The gymnosperms showed up a little bit earlier in the fossil record, 305 million years ago. They were present during the Mesozoic era. Um, and they are better suited to drier conditions than our non-vascular or bryophyte plants. While the angiosperms started to take over towards the end of the Mesozoic and are present more in our terrestrial ecosystems. We still do obviously have the cone-bearing gymnosperms, the conifers. They tend to exist more in um, colder environments, northern latitudes. Okay, so the different phyla for the gymnosperms, we have the cycads, the ginkgos, the gametophytes, and the conifers. Um, the cycads are the ones that are going to have larger combs and more palm-like leaves. We don't have so many of those anymore. There's only one ginkgo plant that we're going to be talking about. It's We see those a lot. They're ornamental trees and they're able to resist air pollution, which is definitely needed these days. And then there's three genus or genera in the Gametophyta phylum. Some are tropical, some are found in more desert areas. And then the conifers, again, are the evergreen plants that we tend to see year round and are able to conduct photosynthesis because they constantly have their leaves. Okay, so there are some examples of the Gametophyta and the Coniferophyta. If we look at the pine seed a little bit more, just going through a little bit more here of the life cycle of the gymnosperm. Again, we're not going to focus on this so much due to time, but there's some more information about that if you are interested in it. We're going to go on now to the angiosperms, seed plants that have flowers and fruits for their reproductive structure. Again, we see these all over the place. They're very diverse. Adaptations that are unique to the angiosperms obviously are those flowers and fruits. The flower is, although pretty, is a very specialized structure that allows sexual reproduction to take place. Again, pollination can occur by insects or animals or sometimes even wind. The flower has 4 different types of leaves. It has sepals that surround the flower, the petals, which help to attract the pollinators, the stamens, which are able to produce pollen, and then the carpels, which are your ovules. Um, the stamen has a filament and it has an anther where it's able to make the pollen. The carpel has the ovary and it has a style that leads up to the stigma where you can get the pollen to fertilize the egg. Okay, so there's your picture showing the male and the female reproductive structures of an angiosperm. Fruits are mature ovaries. They can have other parts attached to them. They help to protect the seeds. They also help to disperse them. They could be fleshy or dry. And again, they can be carried just the same ways we talked about before with the other seeds. So adaptations to help to enhance speed dispersal, that they can attach to things through barbs. They have the wings that allow them to travel, and then they're stored in fruits so that they can be transported by animals from one location to another. Again, angiosperms flowers have both males and females. We talked about where the pollens are found in the anthers, microsporangia, the female gametophytes found in the ovule. And then they have the ability to ensure cross-pollination, cross-pollination between flowers that came from the same species that aren't necessarily on the same plant. And when the pollen grain lands on the stigma, it germinates, and then the pollen tube of the male gametophyte will grow down to the ovary, and then the ovule gets entered through the micropyle pore. Okay, this part's kind of neat. You actually will have double fertilization take place. 2 sperm will actually be discharged into the female gametophyte. One fertilizes the egg, and the other combines with the nuclei in the central cell to create the endosperm, which is the food storing component, which allows that embryo to be able to nourish and until it is ready to form its own plant. So seeds, the embryo consists of a root, and it has the 2 seed leaves called the cotyledons. Okay, so again, more about that if you're interested. Uh, Darwin says that angiosperms are an abominable mystery. We think that the angiosperms came about around 140 million years ago. Late Mesozoic, the branches diverged from their common ancestor, And we are using the information we have available and trying to acquire more information to be able to better understand the evolutionary history of angiosperms. There are fossils from 125 million years ago that share some traits with living angiosperms but lack others. So there's an example of one. It's got anthers and seeds but doesn't have petals and sepals. Um, the ancestors of the angiosperms and gymnosperms diverged about 305 million years ago. They are thought to be closely related to bennettitails, um, and ambarella and water lilies are likely to have been descended from two of the more ancient angiosperm lineages. And so this is just showing the evidence for why they think the ambarellas are more closely related to the gymnosperms, and more research is being examined at this time or being explored to determine these relationships. Angiosperms make up over 250,000 of our living species. We thought previously they were divided into monocots and dicots with one cotyledon and two cotyledons. Um, and the monocots, that very well may be the case, but the dicots actually aren't going to be as straightforward as we thought. They are thought to be polyphyletic. The eudicots are going to make up most of your dicots, but there are some small lineages that come off from them, the basal angiosperms and then the magnolids. And we'll talk about each of those. So these are the basal angiosperms, um, small lineages that, again, are separate from our monocots and from now our eudicots, the water lilies, the star anise, the magnolias. Magnolias, laurels, black pepper plants, they are more related to the monocots and the eudicots than they are to the ones we just talked about, the basal angiosperms. And then the monocots are orchids and lilies are some examples. Again, they're going to make up over a quarter of our angiosperm species. Well, the eudicots are what primarily we see when we are dealing with our seed angiosperms. Dog roses, poppies, snow peas, zucchinis. And then those are just some differences between the monocots and the eudicots, just to kind of show you a little bit of a contrasting between the two. Um, so, how animals and angiosperms are connected together, evolutionary speaking. They influence each other's evolution in terms of animals, what they want to eat will influence what type of defenses plants will try to put up. And then we also have the pollination taking place. So the plants want to be able to attract pollinators to be able to get the pollen to travel. Um, just a random fact, clades with bilaterally symmetrical flowers have more species than those with radial symmetrical flowers, because it's thought maybe that this had to do with the pollinators and reducing of gene flow. So I think this is the last section. Human welfare definitely is dependent on our seed plants. They help to give us food, they help to give us fuel, they help to give us sources of medicine, they give us sources of energy. And so keeping this diversity present is super duper important. We get our fruits and vegetables from angiosperms. We also get wheat and rice and maize and potatoes and cassava. We eat that a lot in Sierra Leone, sweet potatoes. Um, and because of what we are able to do now in the lab with artificial selection, we're really able to harness the power of these plants and increase the amount that is generated for our needs. Um, and I talked about the wood and the medicine. Here are just some examples of different plants and the medicines that they are able to create from those plants. But one of the biggest concerns with plant diversity is are taking over the planet, destroying their habitat. As we clear out trees for energy, we are reducing places for those plants to be able to grow and to continue to thrive and to continue to evolve and adapt to their new environment. So we are losing species as we continue to clear out their environments. So it's something that definitely has to be considered how what you're going to get lose for what you're gaining. It's also thought there could be some other sources of medical compounds that might be present in some of these plants. And that's just kind of an example of 9-year change in the Brazilian forest. Pretty wild. Okay. And then these are some of the derived traits of seed plants. This might help you a little bit with some of your project. And I think that's the end of chapter 30.